Now, he said it again last night when the Prime Minister talked about the absence of a deal on trade with the EU and the need to prepare for none to be done. He talked about a solution that is more like the Australian relationship with the European Union than a Canadian relationship with the European Union. But it wasn't just him. The Foreign Secretary mentioned it as well when I talked to him yesterday.
We need to be very, very clear. There's now a strong possibility that we will have a solution that's much more like an Australian relationship with the EU than a Canadian relationship with the EU.
We're ready to leave the transition period. We would much prefer a deal. No stone is being left unturned. But otherwise, we'll make a successor Brexit on Australian-style rules.
Boris Johnson and then Dominic Raab. Let us talk to Chris Morris, our reality check correspondent. And is there any difference at all between Australian rules, an Australian relationship, etc., and just WTO terms?
No, Australian-style deal means no deal. I mean, you can use slightly different words like arrangements and so forth, but the basis of the relationship between Australia and the EU is that those basic WTO terms, because it doesn't have an overall free trade agreement with the EU, even though it has been trying to negotiate one for the last 2 years. Even if you change the language and don't say Australia-style deal and talk of arrangements, it's still not an accurate description of what could be facing the UK in 3 weeks' time, because while it doesn't have a free trade agreement, Australia has at least a dozen agreements with the EU which make trade easier in some form on things like agricultural tariffs, on wine, on what's called mutual recognition of conformity assessments, which means reducing bureaucracy and checks on things like product standards. And if our talks with the EU break down, we wouldn't have anything like that. So the no deal the UK would be facing would be an even more limited trading relationship with the EU than Australia has.
Right, so it is not an Australian deal. It is not even an Australian deal that we would get.
It's not even an Australian deal. And also the comparison is flawed because geography still really matters in trade. Maybe not quite as much as it once did, but it's worth noting that Australia does have free trade agreements with its nearest neighbours because those are its most important markets. And it obviously wants a closer relationship with the EU, but at the same time, the EU is simply not as important a trading partner for Australia as it is for the UK. It doesn't do nearly as much trade with the EU. And crucially, it doesn't have those complex supply chains with the EU that the UK has, which are so important for us in sectors like cars, chemicals, food. So, border checks and delays don't do as much damage to Australia's trade with the EU as they could do to the UK's.
And you mentioned there tantalisingly that they are not happy with having an Australia relationship with the EU. In other words, they want something better.
Yeah, I mean, they've been negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU for the last couple of years. We did have the former Prime Minister on Question Time last night saying Australia's relationship with the EU is not one from a trade point of view that Britain would want, frankly. And I think the overall point is if the government wants to argue that no deal would be good for the country, allowing us to strike out on our own, it can obviously do that. But there's a sense, I think, that it's invoking Australia because it's a reassuringly familiar place where I don't know, they play cricket and speak English, but that does not make it an accurate description of the situation we would find ourselves in with no deal on January the 1st.
It's where good neighbours become good friends, you could say, Chris, but I wouldn't ask you to go into that. Chris Morris, thank you. We'll be talking about all this later on in the programme. In fact, we have Oliver Dowden, Culture Secretary, at 8:30, maybe asking him with his knowledge of theatre, etc., why that term, Australian relationship, is used.
And I'd never put you down for a fan of Neighbours. You learn something new every morning.